basically said, coming here is like going to the gym. If it doesn't hurt, you're not doing it right.
Morgan Stanley, Revolut, Sequoia. It's hard to find a CV with higher brand signal than George Robson's. But do CVs even matter when trying to pick talent? Today I speak to George, who I first met 8 years ago when he was at Revolut.
Am I going to take this leap of faith and join this company to step out of a pretty blue chip organization, to step into sort of this big question mark? It was pretty scary.
Revolut has since gone on to become the most valuable private company in Europe, recently hitting a $75 billion valuation. He was then picked to be one of the youngest partners at Sequoia, the most respected and storied VC firm in the world.
Most people at Sequoia have a path to Sequoia like mine, and it's effectively a muscle. Like over the course of your lives, you need to...
Sequoia's investments have gone on to create trillions of dollars in value and currently make up a remarkable 25% of the market cap of all NASDAQ companies. We sat down with George to unpack his journey to success.
And the mistake that lots of people make is...
George, we first met, I think you must have been in your early 20s when you were working at Revolut. How did you end up at Revolut at the start of your career?
I think we all have these lucky breaks, right, at different points in our journeys. Revolut really changed my life, right, in so many ways. I was studying in London. I went to the London School of Economics. I was working on a range of different projects when I was there, one of which I co-founded this accelerator with some of my friends called Kickstart. And in my final year, I was on a panel talking about this small accelerator, who knew what that would eventually become. And Revolut was on that panel when it was a pre-seed company. So it was really just luck. It was like sat on campus in the middle of nowhere. And then I met this company. I joined a year later. And the reason for it, honestly, was I loved traveling. Growing up, it was always important to me. Having a travel card that was free, it was going to matter. And then meeting the intensity of that culture was really what dragged me in and convinced me to join.
Nice. Yeah, I remember walking away from that meeting thinking, firstly, how ambitious your plans were, because you were launching a concierge product as part of, I think, Revolut Premium at the time.
Yeah.
And also thinking, it's going to be much harder than they think.
Yeah, and how uneducated our plans were. Yeah, probably, yeah.
And so you move from, what has become the most valuable startup in the whole of Europe recently, valued at $75 billion, to a career move to Sequoia as one of the youngest partners at the age of 25?
Yeah, I think, again, obviously, you have these small interactions with people that put your life on a slightly different path. And it was funny because Revolut, as you say, became a much bigger business. And it was at such a scale where I was thinking about what to do in my life, how to take that next chapter. And actually, I went out and was fundraising for a company that I was going to found, not even in fintech, in healthcare, was in the process of actually closing that round. And then somebody said, why don't you speak to Sequoia? And I never met Sequoia. There was nobody in Europe at that time. I'd obviously heard of the brand and some of the reputation, but none of the details. And when I got introduced, initially the guys on my side was maybe I can get Sequoia into this fundraise, let's see what happens. And it was quite remarkable because the interview process for Sequoia was very focused on, you as a person. Actually, most of it, 75% plus of it is really you before 21 years old, right? So I was jumping into these conversations that I thought were maybe founder conversations. They probably thought were maybe candidate conversations. And I remember having a conversation with a guy called Roelof Botha, who until literally a couple of weeks ago, was running Sequoia. And he'd spent a lot of time investing in healthcare. And he really took the time in that conversation to explain why this was not the right business, why I should think about maybe doing something else. Maybe that something else can mean coming to Sequoia. And over the course of, another 10 hours of conversations, that was a decision that was ultimately made. So pretty wild. Amazing.
I think one of the highest leverage skills that anyone can have in life is being able to attract and select talent. As a founder, obviously critical in building teams. As an investor, critical in finding the right founders and teams to invest in. You seem to have done very well in selecting talent to join as a team member, right? And obviously, joining two of the most storied brands in both the startup world and the investing world.
When I was younger, I had this notion, and I only articulated it better sort of as I got older, but this difference between being driven and being ambitious, right? Because ambitious is that you have this level of drive, there's sort of a magnitude to the vector, but you have direction in it, right? When I was younger, I knew I was pretty driven, but I didn't really know where to invest that energy. And the reality is I found that quite scary, actually, for a long time. And the only way I could sort of reason to solve that problem is to try and associate myself with other people that I thought were great, hoping they knew slightly more than me in terms of having that direction. And it was funny because when I went to LSE and I studied a lot of mathematics and game theory, there's actually a notion in game theory that is built around that, which is something called a Schelling point. It's like this sort of uncoordinated equilibrium. And it's important for me because actually if you have like smart young people, having that density inside the same room is obviously important. I think what I didn't appreciate is coming out of LSE, I thought everybody would look shiny, right? It would be about your CV, the logos, university you attended, different characteristics. And I remember when I was actually leaving Morgan Stanley, I was at Morgan Stanley for about 10 months, leaving Morgan Stanley to go to Revolut and going on LinkedIn and going on the people section and looking at all these profiles. Loads of universities I'd never heard of, loads of companies I'd never heard of, loads of sort of random looking CVs, and thinking, am I going to take this leap of faith and join this company to step out of what I perceived as a pretty blue chip organization to step into sort of this big question mark? And it was amazing for me because reality is it was the highest talent density organization I've been a part of, maybe over my whole life, but certainly, up to that point. And it was driven by actually the intensity of the people. And I think what I had completely underappreciated going into that is actually we care much more about slope, not intercept, right, for these people. Effectively, their capacity for learning, their comfort with ambiguity. I think just the level of aggressiveness with which they pursue their craft. And I hadn't really seen it because I've been surrounded by people that were very competent and on the right path, but generally hadn't taken decisions with lots of agency. They weren't making tough choices. They weren't making brutal trade-offs. They weren't doing things that were fundamentally different to other people around them. And that was true of the Revolut team. And I think if you look at Sequoia, it's also true because the reality is most people at Sequoia have a path to Sequoia like mine in that they weren't thinking about becoming an investor. By the time I actually joined Sequoia, I'd never even angel invested in a company. It was the only set of interviews I did with a venture firm. It was pretty scary, but it was okay because I understood that everybody around the room kind of looked the same in that, at least in that capacity. And everybody understood the same about me, right? And they were trying to bet on my slope, not intercept at that point in my career.
In terms of like investing, you probably see hundreds, if not thousands of founders a year. You're looking obviously for, as you said, slope, people who are learning the quickest, who have that intensity, who are going after it. What are some of the other things which immediately highlight to you this is someone worth investing more time in and potentially making an investment?
Yeah, I think so. Just maybe focusing on the people side, I think there's a few characteristics. So we care about obviously domain expertise, right? It's proving that you understand the sector or industry in which you're going to build. Ideally proving that you've earned those insights and you've pushed harder than other people, because there's this nuance of like, you've got to be curious about things, passionate when you are curious about something such that you invest time on it. And then ideally, good enough, you have aptitude such that you're going to be excellent. So we want to see that trajectory in the domain. Similarly, we apply that same rubric to the functional expertise. And we sort of assess for the things you want to build, are you exceptional at some function, but is it correlated with the success of the business? Because we see plenty of people that go out into areas where they don't have an unfair advantage. I think that's the obvious stuff. I think the more important thing actually is we'll often start with a question, which is basically tell me about, your personal origin story. And the mistake that lots of people make is they jump into the founding story, the last 6 weeks of doing X, Y, Z and speaking to customers and blah, blah, blah. The reality is it's the same question that people ask when they interview me at Sequoia. Really, it's like, where did you grow up? Did you have siblings? What are your siblings doing with their lives? Why are you doing something that's different? What are your parents like? How's the relationship? How has it changed over time? And you're trying to get to, I guess, the foundational belief that actually a lot of the primitives that make who you are, probably were formed pre-18. Many of them may have actually been formed sort of 10 to 15, where you sort of first discovered the world and interacted it with the first time. And I think that is honestly the most important thing in terms of predictive value, in terms of your curiosity, as I say, your passion, and ultimately your aptitude.
Amazing. A lot of founders I see, at least, first-time founders, I think it's a mistake, but they have this notion that they need to hire people who have these glorious CVs, going back to the CV point, poaching talent from these big names. And I kind of have this notion that actually your whole job as a founder, particularly at the very early stage, is trying to find undiscovered talent. And you have to use your advantages as a nimble early stage company where people are going to get given a lot of responsibility very quickly to attract that talent. But what do you think about this notion of investing in undiscovered talent versus proven talent?
The difference there can be basically hunger, right? I think between those two groups. I was speaking to a founder last week that we're going to be in business with. He made it to me, instead of using the word underdog, he described it as, I want to recruit people that are here to make it, right? This is their moment, this is their shot, and they understand that. The reality is that actually that's a social contract, if you think about it, right? Because it's you projecting that if you come here and you solve problems in the right way, you will be given, increasing amounts of responsibility. You will be rewarded for that responsibility, and it will contribute in a meaningful way to the business. That is a social contract. Yeah. And actually, when I think about myself joining Revolut, that was the way Nick projected it to me. He basically said, coming here is like going to the gym. If it doesn't hurt, you're not doing it right. I remember thinking that's kind of crazy. So I think establishing that social contract and remembering that your culture doesn't need to be for everybody, right? It needs to be for somebody is important. And I think the important thing, obviously, is that when you give people responsibility, they're not always going to deliver, right? So the flip side of that social contract to prevent your company descending into total chaos is that you need to be attracting and hiring those great people, but you also need to be pretty opinionated around who you retain. right? What the subset is inside the company at all, but certainly on the most important projects.
One legacy of companies like Revolut is the mafia of other founders that spawned from the initial team. And Revolut certainly have a number of examples of that. You've got Alan, who's gone on to found Fuse Energy, reportedly raising a multi-billion-dollar valuation at the moment. Many other companies that have come out of Revolut. How do you think Nick sees that as a founder? Is that something he's very proud of? Does he encourage people to leave and start their own companies, or is he trying to retain talent?
He doesn't encourage people to leave, but he definitely respects it. And he gives a lot of feedback when you work with Nick over a long period of time in different situations of like, if you were running the business, this is how you would do this. Or he'll nudge you to remember that like, this is why you need to step up and make this decision. Because if you ever want to be a founder in the future, this is the kind of thing you will need to do. So it's definitely baked into the conversation, I think, around the culture, but it's baked into the structure. The reasons I mentioned of, you need to think about how you expand your different, ownership inside the company, you get rewarded for that intensity. All of that stuff is aligned with the founder experience.
Nice. On that journey, like at Revolut and now Sequoia, is there a personal weakness that you've had to confront and overcome in order to succeed?
I think a big one is around conflict, actually. I think maybe this is unfair, but I probably attribute it to two things. I think one, it was not always trivial growing up for me to manage like emotions in my house. And I think I took a lot of responsibility on that as someone that was the oldest of like quite a large family. And I think that it basically meant I was in a mediation role for a long time. Well, actually conflict is fine. And I think the second piece actually is British culture. I think British culture is nuanced. I think it's not always rewarded to have those micro frictions, that actually you need to have very productive conversations with people you care about. And it took me a long time, I think, to sort of reflect on that. I think the biggest gift, honestly, was going to Revolut because, not to over-rotate it, but like Russian culture is absolutely built on perfect clarity. You know where you stand all the time. People give constant feedback. There is no ego or emotion around it. And it was a pretty brutal education, actually. And working with someone like Nikolai, that is his defining grace, is actually his ability to have direct communication with everyone. And I really treat that as the unexpected benefit of working at that company is sort of changing my attitude around conflict and those tough conversations.
The obstacle is the way. A couple of years ago, we spoke. We were at Wimbledon together, and you gave me some insights into how Nick operates Revolut. What do you think are some of the secrets to their success in terms of how they operate their team?
So for a little bit of context, so Nick was a physicist by training, so very first principles thinker. He was a state swimming champion, big athlete, very important through line in his life. And then he was a trader, right? So this was his third professional job, the last two being trading. And trading is a black and white P&L, look at a screen, have perfect clarity on the world. And it's amazing because the company is obviously much bigger today, but he spent, just as a small tidbit, the last couple of years building a product himself as PM inside the company that is the core Revolut People Ops platform. And it's still the most sophisticated thing I've ever seen, having worked at Sequoia for 5.5 years now, over how to run a team, but also instill that culture in the operations of the team. So there is near perfect telemetry inside the company on all aspects of what everybody is doing, operational, financial, cultural, risk-based. The amazing thing about that is it means the social contract is incredibly clear. Nick basically agrees with you, every 6 months, what is the KPI you want to deliver? You negotiate the resourcing, which you think about it as like objective function, subject to constraints, the constraints being the resourcing. And the social contract is if you deliver, those resources will grow and they will expand. And if you don't deliver, they may shrink or be disbanded. And that sounds sort of awkward at like thousands of FTE company scale. The reality is for C-stage founders, that is the deal, right? You don't always get more money or more runway or more leeway in how you live your life. So really what he's doing is he's trying to introduce somewhat artificial constraints to bring a level of intensity that is unnatural to the way the company operates. And I think it's formed on this insight that if you think about a business, on the x-axis, it's like number of people you hire, y-axis, the quality. When you hire your millionth employee, it's going to tend to the average of the whole population, right? Because you're hiring everybody out there. But he wants to protect that for as long as possible. And he does it through this process and through this intensity.
Nice. Going back to your childhood, do you think are there particular moments or is there a particular sort of childhood trauma that led you to be as ambitious and as driven as you are today?
So I think for my parents, among the first people in both of their families to go to university, I think education was very important for them for different reasons. And I think they chose decisions over what they did with their careers. It was much more focused on stability. And I think, obviously providing for us and me and my sisters. And the reality is that when we got to, an age where we can make a decision of where we wanted our schooling to be, I always knew I wanted to play sport. Sport was something that was, a passion of mine. I wanted to see where it was something I could push further. But we just couldn't afford to go to private schools to be able to make that possible. So the contract basically was, and it started at 10, and then it was at like 10 and 12 and 13 and 16, was go out and get scholarships to be able to attend the schools you wanted to be able to do. And it wasn't only one scholarship, it was multiple scholarships I had to stack at the same school to make that possible. And I think about that because it was a choice. There was no pressure of like, if you want to do this, this is what it's going to take. But actually that's, I'd say, younger than most people feel sort of responsible for their own sort of financial viability. But the reality was, you survive on the generosity of strangers. So like the flip side of that is, you're participating in this new set of opportunities through people you don't know. You're surrounded by a much broader set of people than I otherwise would have met. And I really thought about schooling as I wanted to ideally get scholarships to schools where there was a high percentage of people that were on some kind of scholarship. So there was some notion of it being meritocratic and surrounded by that culture of excellence. And then the honest reality is I met people in that journey that I would never have otherwise seen that completely changed my life. So I think that level of responsibility and ownership early was important. And also that idea of just feeling like pretty grateful, I think, for what I was doing and recognizing that I had to capitalize on that opportunity. I think that's where the intensity comes from.
Yeah, I think you learned the value of work, obviously, at a very, very young age, right? What is one thing you believe strongly that most people would disagree with?
So this was actually something that Roelof Botha also exposed me to. There is this management theory from the 1980s, which is something called the time span of discretion. I think it's a very powerful concept. It's this notion that everybody has a time horizon of a problem they are comfortable solving. And that is often pretty poorly incorporated with like how ambitious they think they are, how smart they think they may be. And it's effectively a muscle. Like over the course of your lives, you need to work out how to solve more meaningful, more complicated, longer duration problems. I think the reality for most people, that is much shorter than they think it is. So the scope of what they're able to handle in their lives is much shorter than they think it is. And I think it takes time and mentorship and support to be able to fix that.
What's one decision you've made in your career which people thought was crazy at the time, which turned out to be correct?
Honestly, I remember having conversations around joining Revolut, and it wasn't just the risk piece of it. It was actually joining it at a time where there was a notion that maybe neobanks would be important, and Monzo was everywhere. Mm-hmm. I remember getting off the DLR after joining Revolut and seeing everybody paying with these orange cards and thinking, what am I doing in my life? Did I take the swing? Did I take the wrong swing? Is this happening? So I think believing in that was pretty important.
Looking forward, is there a particular sector or area that you believe in now, which most people would disagree with?
So I think we have been advocates for crypto for a long time. Like I certainly personally have since sort of 2016, 2017. I think what is fascinating is there's been a level of recognition really in the last 9 to 12 months that actually regulated financial institutions, people in sort of more traditional industries will probably want to adopt digital assets across a range of use cases. But you have these beautiful moments in time where there's that insight and there's this sort of increase in demand. And the reality is there's a very small end of people on the planet who have any idea how to build those technologies. And many of those people don't want to work at many of the companies that want to have it. So you have these beautiful supply and demand mismatches for labor. I think this is going to be one of the biggest dislocations because if there's 27 million or 30 million software engineers in the world, the end of people that know how to write in Solidity or know how to write things directly onto the blockchain, we're talking like hundreds of thousands of people. And if you think about other industries that have a similar concentration, it's basically AI, right? Like AI research is similar order of magnitude. And I think AI is obviously something that gets a huge amount of coverage for reasons I would understand. But I think actually thinking about how digital assets will shape these things and the amount of power centered in a relatively small number of people there is important to consider.
What's a belief you've changed your mind about over time?
I always enjoyed maths and physics and sort of slightly more technical subjects. And then I went to Revolut where the culture was very much that way. And I think, part of the mechanics of that business was actually around ROI. It was very mechanical. I think I underappreciated for a long time that actually being creative is, yes, something you're born with, but it's actually a skill. It's something that you can invest in. It's funny today because we have many companies in our portfolio that are like technical founders building an AI who can forget that product marketing is often the last step that people really need, and storytelling and being able to be creative and sort of exemplify what you're building. And I think it's something that I just underappreciated for most of my life.
Yeah, well, we definitely agree with that here. So
here we are.
Okay, I give you $1 million today, George, and you've got to invest it today. Where are you investing it?
Again, I think I'm looking for industries where there's the biggest supply and demand mismatch for labor. And I would actually look at agriculture. I think if you think about, food security, food productivity, food yields, the level of technology penetration, the propensity for people in that industry to even buy technology relative to other markets, it's incredibly low. I think there's going to be a big reshaping. We've seen it in energy. I think that's like one of the first pillars to fall where, proper IQ points are being spent. I think food security is going to be the next big.
Nice. Finish the sentence. Success means...
The beautiful thing about our business, we see into the future in some ways. I want to work on problems, build solutions that will outlast me. It's about the persistence.
Okay, that's it. We're done.